and welcome to the first part of agriculture. I think this is going to have 3 sections to it, but I may change that later. Again, this is Mrs. Grandquist, and hope that you have started reading Chapter 11 in your textbook, and that this information is going to help you understand all of that. So when talking about agriculture, we need to make some distinctions between different types of agriculture and different types of materials that are used and things like that. So the first thing is extensive agriculture versus intensive agriculture. So extensive agriculture is going to use large amounts of land. Ranching, for example, is extensive because you need a great deal of land for each animal that you are raising, because they have a certain amount of pasturage that they will use. Intensive then doesn't necessarily use a lot of land, but uses that land intensely, and you're going to see this especially in areas of high population. Gathering is going to be things on the surface of the land that you are taking in, whereas extraction is coming from beneath the surface. So we can also compare this. We can look at extractive industries that are also extensive. So in the video you saw today on dirt, you saw the strip mining part, and strip mining is extensive, uses a great deal of land. It is extractive in nature to get things out of the earth, and in some ways it is also even an intensive use of the land, because that land often is not able to be used for something else afterwards. Renewable versus non-renewable resources. This simply has to do with how easy it is to replenish that particular resource that is used. So a renewable resource is one that is able to replenish itself and will grow back within a reasonable amount of time. So we can look at wind, for example, replenishes itself. It is considered a renewable resource. Non-renewable resources will not grow back in a particularly rapid time. They may take millions and millions of years to regenerate, for example, petroleum. The tragedy of the commons, I think I mentioned this in our political unit as well. This is something that we look at especially with the agricultural industries of fishing, timber, etc., where you often see land that doesn't come under the control of any one particular person, organization, government, etc., really be overused. And whether it's being overused by overfishing or something like that, like of the high seas, or it's being overused in terms of pollution and pollutive materials and garbage being dumped on it. It's one of the concerns we have. It comes out of the idea of the commons, and the commons used to be the common area for grazing that would be in a small town. So you would have a small village or something, we're talking back to the medieval through the 1800s, and there would be an area that everyone could graze their animals on, and this was called the commons. And what happened often was people would graze the commons with their animals until there wasn't any material left for the animals to eat before they would graze them on their own fields. And so that is that tragedy of the commons, that people will use up what they think they can get for free before they will use their own things. Subsistence versus commercial farming. Very simply, subsistence farming is that farming which is to provide food for your family. And so you may buy some food elsewhere, but most of your sustenance is going to come from the foods or animals that you raise yourselves. Any extra you can sell, but that's going to be a very small amount, whereas commercial farming is done specifically. So our economic sectors, and we have 5 basic economic sectors. I know our little cartoon here only has 4 of them, because quinary is a somewhat more recent addition to our economic sectors. So our primary economic sector is going to be that which extracts or gathers things from the earth itself, basically gathering together or extracting your raw materials. Agriculture is a primary economic activity. Secondary is then taking what you've pulled out of the earth and doing something with it. So if we take our agricultural example here, in the primary economic activity, you may grow vegetables. In the secondary economic activity, you may then put those vegetables in cans. That would be a secondary economic activity. You are processing those raw materials in some way. Tertiary then is going to be services. And so here we're going to see a lot of jobs like retail, medical issues, basically anything which provides a service or skill to people as opposed to actually making something with stuff. So now you're going to sell your can of beans. Quaternary then is going to be highly specialized. It's going to be collection of information, manipulation of information. We're going to look at finance, administration, insurance, legal services are all going to come under quaternary. Quinary then is basically that very highest level of the quaternary. And so these are high level of specialized knowledge or skill, scientific research, the highest levels of management, et cetera, et cetera. Not for like, a small individual company. We're talking much more here, that the CEO of Google would be quinary. So when we look at agriculture around the world, one of the things that we find very quickly is that different things are grown in different places. And so if you take a look here and on the next slide, what you will see is various types of agriculture practiced in various types of places. So if we look here at the top, the United States, you'll notice that we have a lot of things that are basically commercial farming from 7 on down. Actually, even from 6, we have a little bit of 6 in a couple of parts of the United States, and this is all really commercial farming. That's pretty much what we practice here in North America, is we practice commercial farming. If you look down into South America, you'll see shifting cultivation is a pretty dominant part of South America in the northern areas, and this is a type of agriculture that is done for subsistence farming, and you can see that there are 3s as well. They do have some commercial farming. One of the striking things we see in this area is that our commercial farming here, most of it is going to be ranching in some areas, but then we have those 2s, that plantation style agriculture. And the difference between plantation style agriculture and other types of commercial agriculture generally has to do with who owns the land. Is the land owned by foreign companies or foreign nationals, and then they hire locals to do seasonal labor or something like that? Or is it actually owned by the people who live in that particular area? Coffee farming, for example, is often plantation style agriculture, where the land and the goods produced actually are grown for a foreign company, some like Folgers or whatever, and then that stuff is going to be very little of the profit is going to come back to that local community. Almost all of the profits of that crop grown are going to go elsewhere. Okay, so if you take a look here at our areas in the Eastern Hemisphere, you see that Europe is going to have a lot of market gardening. They're going to have a number of commercial farming. Again, we're going to see a lot more commercial farming compared to Africa, where we're going to see a lot more subsistence level farming. And you see this kind of shift between the more developed areas of the world and the less developed areas of the world, and you also tend to see a distinct difference in the types of commercial farming, where in the less developed areas of the world you will see a lot more plantation style farming. It just wasn't really going well. First agricultural revolution is really the Neolithic Revolution, and this is that time period when people moved from having a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle to having a settled lifestyle. And this came about as a result of being able to produce much more food than they had previously. So when they were hunting and gathering, they had a wide variety of food, but it was not necessarily as guaranteed a source of food as we see once we develop agriculture. So one of the things we do see with agriculture and the development of it is it did allow for population growth. Our first places that we're going to see develop agriculture are going to be Southeast Asia, Mesoamerica, the Fertile Crescent, China, North Africa. All of these are going to be places that developed agriculture kind of simultaneously on their own, and then it spread from those areas to others. So we quickly see agriculture spread. If you remember when we talked about the spread of language in the culture unit, one of the things they talked about was the spread of Indo-European may have gone along with the spread of agriculture into Europe, etc. And so this is one of those things where going that far back in the past, it's hard to say exactly what the triggers were, but we do know that very quickly people were moving into more agricultural and less nomadic lifestyles. The domestication of plants, what we're really going to look at here, and this is for really any domestication, is humankind is going to control the reproduction. And so when we're looking at the domestication of plants, we are going to look at humans choosing seeds. So it's not that a plant grows and just, all of its seeds fall down and what grows there. Hey, maybe we'll grow some of this and some of this. We don't know. It's just going to grow, whatever. In agriculture and the domestication of plants, what we're really looking at is humans going, okay, I like this particular plant. This particular plant grew taller and it had more seeds on it than this other plant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear down these other plants and just choose the plants I like the best. And then I'm going to sow those seeds. That is domestication, because humans are then really controlling the reproductive process. With animals, humans are also going to control the reproductive process in terms of breeding. They also provide food for the animals, and the animals provide labor for the humans, or some sort of food source for the humans. So we know that our first plants to be domesticated were really grains, wheat, rice, maize, barley. We have some fruits that are domesticated pretty early, things like apples and peaches, the fruit trees. We have some vegetables, onions, cabbage, soybeans, tomatoes, squash, beans, etc. But the grains were really the first. With our animals, of course, we know that prior to the Neolithic Revolution, we had the domestication of dogs as hunting partners. With the Neolithic Revolution, we're going to see the domestication of cats in order to keep rodent populations in checks. And then herbivores of various types are going to be domesticated either as a food source or as labor. We see our first agricultural villages really being created around 10,000 BCE. We see the invention of the bow and arrow happening around then, the domestication of dogs and reindeer, etc., etc. So all of this stuff is happening kind of at around the same time. If you look at our picture up here at the top, what we're seeing here is kind of interesting. It's the use of animal labor and a tool, a very, very early form of plow. And that plow, as you see, it is going to remain the same. So we have our agricultural diffusion, our major centers of agricultural development, where our first places go on, and then you can see from where they went to where they went, and so we see the spread from Southeast Asia up into East Asia, into South Asia. We see from Southwest Asia into Northern Africa, and these didn't all happen at exactly the same time, but they happened fairly rapidly. The second agricultural revolution, then, this is going to be from the medieval period on through the 1800s. There are some people who limit it from the 17th century to the 19th century, but it's really best thought of from the medieval period onward. So we're talking really from about 1000 CE onward. And the big thing we're going to see here is changes in farming practices. And we're going to see improved cultivation. Crop rotation is the big thing in the medieval period. And What we look at in crop rotation is the idea that you should not grow the same crop in the same soil year after year after year after year, because the nutrients that that particular plant needs will then become depleted. So instead, what you want to do is change up what plants are grown in which fields. Prior to this time, what you had generally done was you would plant, say, wheat in a field one year. The next year, you would plant something else, and then you'd go back and forth between those two crops. Whereas what we're going to see here is the three-field system. And what they do is they plant wheat in the field for 1 year, then they may plant beans the next year, and then they leave it fallow for a year. And so they kind of do this fallow meaning that they don't plant anything in it, and they do that kind of rotation, and what we see is they are able to continue using the same land more intensively by allowing it to rest for a year and basically making sure that the nutrients don't become too depleted in it. Harvesting and storage also improves. We're still using a similar plow to what we had before but we're changing the materials it is built out of. So we move from a wooden to an iron to a steel plow and things like that, which is going to have a big impact. Storage becomes much better. They are able to store food in such a way that it stays good longer. Into the 1800s and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what we're really going to see is the creation of even more tools, the seed drill and things like that. Also in this, we're seeing the harnessing of wind and water power, our windmills for grinding, our water mills, and so on. And so we're seeing the harvesting of power beyond just human and animal labor into the production of particular agricultural commodities. They make a better plow, which fits the horse better, so that helps. And so the horse is able to pull the plow much faster than ox can, and so they are able to increase their increase the production that way, and so on and so on and so on. We're still seeing, and you can see this picture here on the right-hand side, we're still seeing a lot of farming being done by hand. This is not really the time yet of mechanized agriculture. Which then takes us to the third agricultural revolution, when we are in the time of mechanized agriculture. And so this is from the late 19th century through the early 20th century. And mechanization replaces both human and animal labor. We also see the development of monoculture, and so we're no longer practicing that kind of field rotation. Instead, we're growing the same crops over and over and over in the same field, but we are trying to account for the soil depletion through the use of chemical inputs, especially chemical fertilizers, many of which are based in petroleum products, and so is going to increase, the mechanization increases our fuel usage, and then the use of petroleum products in the fertilizers also increases our fuel usage. This type of agriculture especially becomes widespread in North America after World War II. It will spread to Europe and beyond by the 60s. And the next part of this that we really look at as part of this agricultural revolution is food processing. So previously you grew, say, beans, and you stored your beans. Maybe you dried them, maybe you didn't, but you didn't really do a whole lot with them until you got to the cooking process. And there you might actually change them or do whatever you wanted to do in cooking. But with this, we're actually looking at processing the foods either very simply, freezing, canning, etc. That is a very simple type of processing, or a much more complex style of processing, which they call value added. And so what we're looking at here then is turning your food into other food before you get your food. So I'm going to take my beans and I'm going to actually, instead of you cooking them and turning them into refried beans or whatever it is that you want, I'm going to do that for you, and therefore I will charge you more money for that can of beans than you would have paid just to get the beans themselves. Because of the mechanization, we are able to have much a much smaller percentage of the population take part in agriculture. So now in the U.S., only 2% or so of our population takes part in an agricultural industry. And the farm moves from kind of the center of society to just part of what we call the agro-industrial food system. And so that agro-industrial food system is really getting into the big agricultural companies, so Dole, Nestle, all of these companies which have really created their business on controlling the farms, adding value to the food products, and then selling them to people. And you see that, a company like Kraft may own hundreds of other companies, and they control all of that processing. Another thing that we look at in this particular revolution is this idea of the factory farming of animals. So we are going to raise animals, not, your happy little frolicky cow, out in the fields or something like that, getting milked in the morning and the evening and then spending most of its time in pasture. We're really looking at trying to produce animals in the cheapest way possible. Like you can see our picture down at the bottom, which is the factory farming of chickens, and those chickens are probably never going to leave that barn. They are going to spend their whole lives in that barn. And because of that, disease is a major fear, and we're going to see that people will add antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to the chicken feed in order to keep the animals healthy, which then adds antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, into the people who eat those chickens or eggs from those chickens, et cetera, et cetera. If you go to the notes on this particular page, there's a couple of links you may want to check out looking at critiques of industrial agriculture. The how would you like your salmonella scrambled is a little disturbing, but you may find it interesting. The final revolution we're going to talk about is the Green Revolution, and this was basically the beginning of the creation of our genetically modified organisms. It began in the 1960s. It is still in process today, and basically this was attempting to create higher yielding strains, especially of grains, using genetic engineering. And it was done in order to answer the problems of famines in a number of places in the world. So it had a huge impact in some areas, a huge impact in India and China, much less impact in Africa, even though it was attempted there. And the main difference that we see in those two places is the amount of water that was available and the amount of good soil that was still left, which, as you guys know from having watched Dirt today, that the loss of topsoil is of major concern. Now, there have been a number of concerns with this. You can see this guy here at the top is throwing fertilizer on his field by hand. All right, so there's some concerns with, what that could be doing as he is standing in that field that he's fertilizing and breathing in that dust. The man at the bottom is spraying pesticides on his crops. Again, generally in the U.S., you would probably expect someone spraying pesticides to be covered up with almost hazmat gear, and this guy is just breathing in the pesticides as he goes. Other concerns with the Green Revolution that have come up have to do with the fact that the crops grown in the Green Revolution require a great deal of inputs, meaning fertilizers, pesticides, etc. And also because it is a monoculture, meaning you are growing just one crop and there's no diversity even in the one crop you're growing. So because you have genetically chosen exactly one strain of wheat or rice or whatever, a fungus or a pest or something like that that really likes that particular strain is going to possibly wipe out an entire region's agricultural production. Another big concern is the amount of water that these plants need, and so we see a huge increase in the amount of water needed in order to grow these plants. Even though they do produce more, they require more being given to them. And in places where they've given out grants and things like that for people to farm these, one of the problems has been that women have been kind of left out of that process. And as women are more than 50% of the farmers in the world, they are being disproportionately kept out of some of the opportunities that might allow them to improve their state. Okay, so that brings to a close our first agricultural lecture. If you have any questions, you can ask your teachers in class, and have a good evening.